All right, guys, good morning. We are now going to discuss Chapter 12 Using Language. As you all know, you cannot design a speech if, in fact, you don't have the appropriate language. So let's get a little bit into that today. All right, so first all, let's talk about the meaning of words. Words have two kinds of meanings, denotative and connotative. Denotative meaning is precise, literal, and objective. So words that are denotative are precise, literal, and objective. It's the dictionary definition of a word or phrase. It describes the object, person, place, idea, or event to which the word is referenced. One way to think of a word's denotative meaning is as it is dictionary defined. For example, denotatively, the noun school means a place, institution, or building where instruction is given, right? That's the literal dictionary definition of the word school. So when you think of denotative, use the D in denotative to make you know that it means the dictionary definition of a word. Simple as pie. And then we have what is called a connotative meaning of a word. Connotative words, the meaning of those words are suggested by the associations or emotions triggered by a word or phrase. For instance, connotative meaning, it's more variable, it's more figurative and subjective. The connotative meaning of a word is what the word suggests or implies, so it's not the literal definition of the word. For instance, the connotative meaning for the word school includes all the feelings, associations, and emotions that the word touches in different people. For instance, for some people, school might mean it may connotate personal growth, childhood, longing, a special teacher, a special professor. But for others, the word school, may bring up emotions and connotate frustration, boring homework assignments, tests, and quizzes. That's the connotative meaning that can be associated with the word school. And going back to our first definition of denotative meaning, it's the dictionary definition of the word school. So it's more literal as opposed to figurative. So let's talk about using language clearly and effectively. So when we talk about using language accurately, it is so vital to a speaker that they use the words accurately as it is for a person who's a mathematician using numbers accurately. But one student, as the book mentions, found out this the hard way. In a speech about America's criminal justice system, the student referred several times to criminal prosecution instead of criminal prosecution, right? You guys know that there's a difference. They sound very similar, but those words have different meanings. For instance, prosecution deals directly with the legal system, right? When you're prosecuted, that means that you are having to stand trial. And when you are receiving persecution, let's see what that means. So persecution has more to do with religion, right? When you talk about, regardless of your religious background, you probably heard the story of Jesus, right? And they speak about how Jesus was persecuted for his beliefs, his religious beliefs, right? But prosecution is not the same thing as persecution. We all know that. Prosecution, it specifically deals with the judicial system that is conducted to charge someone again for a crime or an act committed that goes against the law. So this student thought that he or she was really, really talented and decided to use the word persecution when he really meant prosecution. So fortunately, you guys don't really have these outright blunders of misusing words. However, it does happen. So when you are doing your speech, you have to make sure that although you may be very confident in what it is that you're discussing, that you really take time to identify if the words that you are using are truly defined in the context in which you're using them in. It's very, very important. For instance, if you look at several words such as education, knowledge, and expertise, all of them are synonyms. However, they sort of have different meanings, or else they wouldn't be different words. So you have to make sure that the word that you use is appropriate for your given speech. Okay? Now we have what's called concrete words versus abstract words. Concrete words refer to tangible objects, right? If you look at the example, well, actually, let's figure out what the book is referring to in this case. So they says that concrete words refer to tangible objects, meaning people, places, or things that you can touch, right? They differ from abstract words, which refer to general concepts, qualities, or attributes, right? So like a carrot, if you give an example of a carrot, a pencil, a nose, or a door, those are concrete words. But things that are not able to be touched and felt are abstract words. For example, humility, right? We don't know what humility feels. Well, we know what it feels like, but we can't physically touch it, right? We know when someone is being humble and when they're not, but we can't put our finger literally on it. And then a word like science, progress, and philosophy, those are very abstract words because you can't actually feel and touch those words. And then when we speak about familiar words, you got to understand that when you're using language clearly, you have to make sure you use certain devices and codes because people are different. What makes perfect sense to one person may be like completely different for another person. You can't assume that what is clear for you, I always say this, right? Everybody has their own frame of reference, and you cannot assume that what is clear for you is clear for your audience. Listeners, unlike readers, cannot turn to a dictionary or reread an author's words to discover their meaning. A speaker's meaning must be immediately comprehensible, meaning that the listener must automatically get exactly what it is that you're saying, or you're not that effective of a speaker. It must be so clear that there is no chance of misunderstanding, right? Because you only get one shot to give the listener exactly what it is that you're trying to tell them. You can ensure that you are using clear language by using familiar words, by choosing concrete words and abstract words, right? And avoid gobbledygook, avoid clutter. So when you use familiar words, you're using everyday terminology, right? Instead of saying, let's see, the guy was a severe alcoholic, maybe you would say he was a drunk, right, to explain your point. One is a little less abstract than the other, right? The guy who's a severe alcoholic, that's kind of abstract, like you can't touch it. But more often than not, many of your listeners would have probably experienced what it is like to be with someone who's a drunk as opposed to someone who's a severe alcoholic. It just sounds more real, more personable. So, outside of using language clearly, you must also use language vividly, right? You guys understand that when you speak, you have to not only make sure that your speaking is conversational, but you also want to make sure that the reader or the listener is able to follow along with you and not just get lost in the gobbledygook of your language, but you're also painting a picture for them so that it makes it more clear. So how do we do that? Just as you can be accurate without being clear, you can also be accurate and clear without being interesting, right? You can have some really, really great facts about, the tax laws in Georgia, right? But if it isn't interesting and it's just informative, then we probably won't really want to listen to your speech. So you want to make sure that just as informative as you are and accurate that you are also being interesting. For example, let's look at what Martin Luther King said in his I Have a Dream speech. It's paraphrased actually from part of this speech. It says, "Turning back is something we cannot do. We must continue to work against police brutality, segregated housing, disenfranchisement, and alienation. Only when these problems are solved will we be satisfied." Right? That's a paraphrase from what Martin Luther King said. But here's his actual speech. We cannot turn back. There are those who ask the devotees of civil rights, "When will you be satisfied?" We can never be satisfied as long as a Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. So you get the point. This is a more descriptive example than what the first example gave us, what the first paraphrase gave us. This second example was more rich in description, more rich in imagery, and that way it was a lot more interesting to me as a reader to actually listen to the speaker, because it gave me a picture in my mind of what the words of the speaker were communicating. So pictures versus language, right? They can go hand in hand, but you want to make sure that they always work to enhance your speech. So how can we continue to use language vividly? There are several ways. We'll talk about the first one, which is imagery. When you are using imagery, you're using vivid language to create mental images of objects, actions, or ideas. Going back to the Martin Luther King example, right? Instead of saying, police brutality, right? He talks about, he doesn't talk about it in this example, but what he could have said, police brutality is a really abstract example, very abstract words. He could talk about, the blood gushing. This is really graphic, but he could talk about the blood gushing from the protester's head after being beaten by police with a baton, right? That graphic image that I just painted in your head allows for the reader to be jarred emotionally, right? You want to have that emotional impact. So, you can use images literally when you're speaking, but sometimes you won't have a chance to show pictures. So how do you want to communicate those images? You want to use really precise, clear, vivid language to do that. And then we have what's called a simile. Simile is another way to create imagery. Simile is an explicit comparison between things that are essentially different, yet have something in common. It always contains, this is key guys, similes always contain the words like or as. So here are some examples. Walking into my grandparents' home when I was a child was like being wrapped in a giant security blanket. Air pollution is eating away at the monuments in Washington, D.C., like a giant tablet of Alka-Seltzer. Right? In both examples, they compared one abstract or one concept to one that was more vivid in language and description. And they used those comparisons by tying like or as, right? Comparing two things to make your point. And then we have what many of you are familiar with, which is the metaphor. You can also use a metaphor to create imagery in your speeches. Metaphor is an explicit comparison between things that are essentially different yet have something in common. Unlike simile, metaphor does not contain the word like or as. So a simile is a type of metaphor, right? But you have to make sure that if you're saying, Professor Moran, I'm going to use a simile as my example, you got to make sure that it contains the words like or as. And if it doesn't, then you're probably likely just using a simple metaphor which does not contain the words like or as. And you can look in your page 229 for an example of a metaphor. And then I'm just going to highlight the ones that you'll have to, that you'll have to use for your homework assignment. So let's talk about just some of them. Let's see. We'll talk about alliteration. Alliteration can enhance your speech as well. It goes hand in hand with the rhythm of your speech, the tone of your speech, and the pace of your speech. The most common method of alliteration is repeating the initial consonant sound of adjoining words. For instance, if you don't know what the word consonant is, you'll have to look it up in order to get this example. But it's on page 231. Here's the example. Peace is essential for progress, but progress is no essential for peace. What do? They highlighted the word, or the first consonant sounds of the word peace, which is a P. It sounds very similar to progress, right? Peace is essential for progress, but progress is not essential for peace. So this is the repetition of the consonant sounds in order to make your speech stronger. Here's another example. Nothing great is accomplished without cooperation, compromise, and common cause. That was a great example of alliteration. Why? Because it used the consonant sounds of the k, right? Cooperation, compromise, common, to all in unison stress the point of what the speaker is wanting to communicate. So use these devices, guys. They will only enhance your speech. These are just some really good examples that are used in your book, but there are more out there, and that's what your job will be to have for next class, for Monday's class, and I'll go into that assignment in a short while. And then I actually really enjoyed this particular device, which is called the antithesis. The antithesis, right, it looks like, if you break it up, it looks like antithesis. But essentially an antithesis is the juxtaposition, meaning the side-by-side comparison. Look up that word, guys, juxtaposition. If I call on you on Monday and you don't know what juxtaposition is, I'm going to know that you did not look up the word. So the antithesis is the juxtaposition of contrasting ideas, usually in parallel structure. So let's look at this closely. We're going to use the examples that are listed in the book on page 232. So the juxtaposition, one is used by President John F. Kennedy. The famous words, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Here's another example. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. It is no accident that both of these examples are used by the president. He always enjoyed using the antithesis form to communicate his points. Because what the antithesis does is that it produces a neatly turned phrase into sort of a really interesting sort of an interesting idea, right? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country, right? It's flipping the idea of service on its head, right? Instead of you asking what your country can do for you and complaining, no, instead ask what you can do for your country. So that was a pretty, very, very, very strong use of antithesis by the president, and that's why that one line still stands as one of the greatest lines in history of the United States. So when you use these words, guys, know that you're going to have an impact on not only yourself as a developed and eloquent speaker, but you're also going to have an impact on your listeners as well. So here's your assignment. You will be tasked with identifying examples in music, literature, film, or speeches in which the following devices were used effectively. So what you'll have to do is choose two or more of these devices, either alliteration, metaphor, parallelism, or antithesis, right? Basically what you're going to do is find maybe lyrics from a song, an excerpt from a speech, or, a dialogue from a movie in which these devices were used. Or you can even actually make up your own, right? If you are really creative or poetic, use your own example. Give me your own example of how you would use alliteration within a speech or within a phrase. How would you use a metaphor? So use these examples, guys, and make sure that you have them with you in class on Monday. I'll be calling on you all to see exactly what you came up with. Looking forward to hearing from you. Have a wonderful weekend, and be sure to email me or give me a call if you have any questions or concerns. I'll talk to you very soon. Bye.